Hello once again, welcome back to the book log, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about Dolores Claiborne by my father, Stephen King. I didn't really know how to start talking about this book, so I think I'm just going to start the review kind of just by dissecting this idea that Stephen King is the master of horror. What does that mean exactly? On one hand, it is easy to understand this reputation given that he has written around 75% of all the most famous horror properties of the last century. But what actually makes his books effectively scary? I would argue, as many others have before, that it is his ability to construct believable, authentic characters that feel like real people. Put them in a scary situation, even if the scary situation is also silly and ridiculous, like a lot of Stephen King works, and it's going to succeed most of the time. The thing about Stephen King's incredibly strong character work is that it also succeeds in other genres and modes as well, which, believe it or not, I think constitutes the majority of his body of work. And that brings us to Dolores Claiborne. Not a horror novel, despite some vaguely horror elements, but certainly a character novel, as evidenced by it being one of only a couple of Stephen King books to be named simply after the main character. And I just so happen to think that Dolores Claiborne is one of the most complex, fleshed out, fully realized characters King has ever created. This kind of singular focus on the character of Dolores Claiborne is apparent even in the format of the book itself. It's just one long, chapterless, non-stop, first-person narration by Dolores herself. No other character speaks a single word in this book. Everything said comes from Dolores herself, from her personal memories and recollections, and I'm not sure it could have worked better in any other way. Her story is very personal and very dark, and the first-hand structure makes it feel incredibly immersive in a way that wouldn't have otherwise been possible. She just feels like a real person, and having the book structured as one long monologue, I think, contributes to that. Now, in terms of what Dolores' story is and why she's telling it in the first place, there's quite a lot to unpack. The frame of the entire novel is that she's giving testimony to the police about her longtime employer Vera Donovan's somewhat suspicious death. But in order to explain that, she has to provide a lot of additional context, and this is what the majority of the story is. I would say there's two main threads to Dolores' testimony: her relationship with Vera Donovan and her relationship with her deceased husband, Joe St. George, who also died under suspicious circumstances. Like a real person telling a long story, Dolores does not tell everything in chronological order. In fact, she sort of tells it backwards, starting with her more recent experiences working with Vera Donovan, then jumps back to her relationship with her husband and family. For the sake of ease, I'm going to try to discuss the events somewhat chronologically. So like I said, the story ultimately centers on the relationship between Dolores and her late husband, Joe St. George, and appropriately, that's where it begins. Joe was a cruel, violent, and abusive man, and Dolores explains that while his physical abuse towards her was bad, it was sadly not uncommon for the time. Domestic violence was just an accepted reality for many women, but what really pushes things over the edge is when Joe begins to sexually abuse their teenage daughter, Selena. When Dolores discovers this, she initially plans to take the kids and run away, but she learns that Joe has also completely emptied the kid's savings account and transferred the funds to an account only he can access, effectively stranding them with him. And this is where Vera Donovan comes into the fold. Vera is this wealthy summer resident of Little Tall Island, the small island city off the coast of Maine where this story takes place, and Dolores is her housekeeper. Since the story isn't told chronologically, their relationship is revealed in kind of fragmented moments over the span of decades. Dolores begins as Vera's housekeeper, but as Vera ages and her health deteriorates, Dolores transitions into the role of her full-time caretaker. Vera is portrayed as this haughty, short-tempered, pretty unpleasant person, but she and Dolores have a certain underlying respect for one another that's shown in subtle moments throughout the entire story. For instance, Vera is the only person Dolores confides in about the situation with Joe and Selena, and Vera provides her with some very interesting advice. To paraphrase, she says something like, "Husbands die in accidents all the time, Dolores. They die and they leave their wives with their money." This obviously carries some implications regarding Vera's own late husband, but it also plants the seeds in Dolores' mind that she might deal with Joe in a more nefarious way, and that's more or less the crux of the novel. Her plan is pretty straightforward, and it unfolds with relative success. That summer, a full solar eclipse passes over the island, and while nearly everyone in town is kind of distracted by the spectacle, Dolores lures Joe to an old abandoned well in the back of their property, and in the dark, he falls in. The entire scene is pretty incredible. For one, having this take place during a solar eclipse, I thought was so cool and evocative. Obviously, a full solar eclipse is an astonishing natural phenomenon by itself, but King describes it in such vivid detail, and it's such a striking backdrop for this murder to take place. Joe's like chasing Dolores through the blackberry brambles while it's pitch black in the middle of the day. It's an incredibly haunting image. And to make matters even more haunting, Joe does not die when he falls in the well as Dolores originally intended. Instead, he survives and is now down at the bottom of the well screaming and begging Dolores to let him out. That's what the cover art of the book is. Joe's perspective at the bottom, peering up at Dolores with the solar eclipse behind her. I just thought the entire sequence was so intense and so visceral. This whole set piece is one of the most memorable in any King book ever, honestly. Also, I'm aware that this ties into Gerald's Game, which I have not read yet, but I am excited to see, whatever connection that ends up being. After this point, Dolores describes just living out the rest of her life, and like any other life, it's complicated. A lot of people in town are suspicious of her involvement in Joe's death to the point where she's questioned by the police, but she's covered her tracks well enough that she's never convicted of the murder. Joe's death also puts a strain on her relationship with her kids, especially Selena, who also suspects the truth of what happened. They never really get along the same way afterwards, even though Dolores did everything she did for Selena. She continues to work for Vera, transitioning into her full-time caretaker, and this is the part of the story that Dolores begins her testimony with back at the beginning of the book, dealing with and cleaning up after Vera's increasingly unpleasant and gross antics. Vera Donovan eventually falls down the stairs and dies, a genuine accident, but given that Vera leaves her entire life savings to Dolores, her death seems a bit convenient, hence the interrogation that constitutes this entire book. I just thought Vera and Dolores had such a complicated, lifelike relationship. It's easily one of the highlights of the book for me. The way that their transactional employer-employee relationship evolves into a dynamic of like begrudging mutual respect is just beautifully rendered, and the way their lives and struggles mirror each other is fascinating. Their connection just felt very deeply human to me. One thing I neglected to mention is how this entire book is written in a sort of rural, working class Maine vernacular dialect. Apparently this is somewhat of a divisive choice, but I personally loved it. For one, people in America speak with different dialects in real life, so it's cool to see that fact reflected in a story like this, but it also gives the book a very distinct personality. Stephen King is from rural Maine, and you can feel that in every page here. These are the people he grew up with, and he knows their lives, he knows their struggles, and he's able to draw on that personal knowledge in such a precise and intimate way. I think that's part of the reason this character in this book feels so authentic and convincing to me. It feels like it was written directly from Stephen King's heart, as lame as that sounds to say. Dolores Claiborne feels real, like she's a manifestation of a real human person, and that feeling makes you buy into this story in a very strong way. And it just so happens that the story is also extremely entertaining too. It's Stephen King doing what Stephen King does best, putting you inside the head of a person going through some extraordinary thing, and I will read that enthusiastically every time. I'm gonna give it an easy 9 out of 10.